You're listening to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast, a place for sex addicts to share their experiences of recovery, to help break the stigma, myths, and misconceptions of sex addiction. This podcast may contain topics of sexuality, sexual trauma, dysfunction, or other things that may be triggering, so listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. My name is Jason, I'm a sex addict, and I will be your podcast host for today. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to episode number 49 of the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. In this episode, I'm happy to be sharing a recording from the quarterly Bay Area SAA and COSA Speaker meeting that happened this past February. This week, we'll be hearing from Brian T., who is a member of COSA, and I know Brian through his wife, who is a member of my home group. I first met Brian when he was a speaker at an open COSA speaker meeting around 5 years ago, and since then, we've had a chance to talk at picnics, but I really got to know him better through this recording. For the reading this week, I had originally planned on picking out a reading from the COSA website, which is COSA-recovery.org, but after hearing Brian's share, I thought more about intimacy avoidance. However, I did want to share something I found in the COSA meeting guide, and this is from pages 20 and 23. And for anyone who is new to the podcast or new to SAA, COSA is a 12-step program similar to SAA, but its focus is on anyone whose lives have been affected by sex addiction. So the first reading comes from the ISO of COSA diversity statement. COSA diversity is consistent with the third tradition of COSA, which states the only requirement for COSA membership is that our lives have been affected by compulsive sexual behavior. The COSA Fellowship welcomes all genders, all varieties of relationship to the addict, all religious and spiritual preferences, all employment statuses, all marital statuses, and all ethnicities, cultures, and languages. COSA does not discriminate on the basis of class, sexual orientation, or gender identification, physical or mental challenges, race, or national origins. In COSA, we find hope whether or not there is a sexually addicted person currently in our lives. COSA diversity is consistent with the first tradition of COSA, which states that our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon COSA unity. Another thing that I found in the COSA meeting guide is called Listening for Similarities. Within COSA's diverse fellowship, we find a wide range of viewpoints and experiences. It might be tempting to think that we don't have much in common with those around us in meetings, and yet, when we listen for similarities rather than focusing on differences, we feel more connected. We can learn from the experience of others, even if their situation is very different from ours. And the next section is being present for others. Being present for others means bearing witness to their healing process. We cannot save or rescue someone from his or her pain or situation, but we can help make our meeting an emotional safe haven by listening without criticism or judgment. When members feel safe, they are more inclined to share things that they have never uttered aloud to anyone before. This kind of honesty is deeply healing. For those who struggle with acceptance of others, it is helpful to remember that each of us grows and heals in our higher power's time and in our higher power's way. So thinking of that last reading, Brian really opened up about struggles in his marriage, which led me to this reading from the intimacy avoidance pamphlet put out by the ISO of SAA. I've read parts of this pamphlet in episode 20 of the podcast, and I wanted to focus on the first 3 paragraphs here. And I'll put links to both of these in the show notes. And this comes from the pamphlet, Intimacy Avoidance, Another Aspect of Sex Addiction. Below the waterline. Most of us came to our first Sex Addicts Anonymous meeting when we could no longer deny that we had a problem. Perhaps we once maintained the illusion that our addiction was not visible to others, but in reality, it was all too obvious. For this reason, addictive sexual behaviors such as promiscuity, infidelity, compulsive masturbation, prostitution, sexual assault, molestation, and exhibitionism are often referred to as sexual acting out. These readily identifiable behaviors had the potential to kill, injure, infect, or incarcerate us, and deeply affected those we loved. These dangers seemed like the part of an iceberg that we could see from above the waterline, and they deserved our immediate attention. The recovery principle of first things first suggested that we focus on the addictive sexual behaviors that were killing us the fastest. Over time, though, some of us became aware of less obvious forms of sex addiction that were lurking below the surface. Intimacy avoidance refers to conduct and attitudes that serve to avoid or block sexual, emotional, or spiritual connection with others, ourselves, or our higher power. Many sex addicts compulsively avoid their feelings or have difficulty being emotionally vulnerable with others. When this intimacy avoidance becomes focused on avoiding anything to do with sex, it is sometimes called acting in. For some sex addicts, a diverse set of compulsive, sexually avoidant behaviors had always painfully dominated our lives. For others, avoidant behaviors only became apparent once we abstained from acting out. Some of us have even acted out and acted in simultaneously. For example, some of us used our sexual acting out to avoid sex in our committed relationships. We also engaged in additional specific behaviors to avoid intimacy and sex in these relationships. So I've mentioned on other episodes of the podcast that I struggle with intimacy avoidance, and I will definitely have more to share about that after hearing from Brian at the SAA COSA Speaker meeting, as well as sharing some music that has been helping me in my recovery this week. And that's enough for me here at the beginning. So without further ado, here is Brian at the SAA and COSA speaker meeting. I hope you enjoy it.
Well, thank you. I'm starting my own timer here, and I'll just get going. I'll start with a quote. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. Hi, my name is Brian. I'm a COSA, and I'm a COSA because my life has been affected by compulsive sexual behavior. I'll come back to the quote in a little bit. And I think probably most of you don't know me, and so I'll give you a very brief kind of history of how I came to be here today in order to give you some perspective, and then I'll jump into what I want to talk about, which I actually don't want to talk about, but I'll talk about that too. I am married. I've been married for 26 years. I have 3 kids, age 20, 16, and 14. My wife is my qualifier. She's a sex addict. My initial discovery was about 9 years ago, and that was of an affair with a neighbor. And I know that many in COSA face a decision that we lovingly call a stay or go decision. And I didn't feel like I had a choice. And so I stayed, and I really couldn't see a life apart from her or without her. And so I like I said, I didn't feel like I didn't have a choice, at least initially. And there was a moment in the first few weeks that was really impactful. So I wanted to share about that real quick. We were planning to go to counseling, and I called her on my way home from work, and I don't remember the exact details, but she didn't want to go. And I misunderstood, and I thought that she was basically done with our marriage. So I got home, and there was a lot of passive aggressive stomping around and slamming doors and stuff like that, because that's the way we acted. in those days, and still do to some extent. And we've taught our kids that, which we regret. But in the midst of that, it kind of came to a head, and she told me, I don't love you. I've never loved you, and I don't expect to ever love you. And those kind of cover all the bases. I'll give you a little hint about that, the end of the story, which is that was not true. But that was really, really painful to hear, and haunted me for a long time, and still pokes at me here and there. My life was pretty unmanageable. There was a lot of hypervigilance. A lot of COSAs tell that same story. In that, there's no logic to it. There's logic in my brain, but the logic is this flawed logic of a traumatized brain. And really, it felt like somehow, if I could just prove, even though I knew what was going on, if I could just find out whatever it was that I was trying to find out, and just kind of stand there and say, aha, see, that somehow that would make everything all better. And I don't know why I don't think that was a conscious thought, but that was really what was driving me, of like, I could do something to make this all better. And that was what it seemed like I needed to do. And that wasn't true. That, fortunately, there was never a moment of trying to, of getting to that point of standing there with the evidence of whatever it was. But it didn't take me long to realize that that was like drinking poison for me, that hypervigilance. Another thing that I did early on was set myself apart, and her apart as well. It was what I call the gender barrier, because that's what I latched onto. There weren't a lot of guys in COSA, and so I just, I saw myself as different, and different being less impacted, I suppose, is a way to say it. And that she was different. Her addiction was lesser than anybody else's that I heard people talking about. And I heard stories that kind of fit, but I set myself aside as different. And that meant that limited my recovery. About 6 months in, I had a second discovery, and that was really where I had the realization that I'm not different. She's not different. I do belong here, and that I have choices. And I made the choice. I was able to set a strong barrier, a boundary, that I would not live with an active sex addict. And that's kind of when I started to be able to see a life apart from her too. I won't go into a lot of the more details. There's a lot more to the story. There were 3 more affairs and 2 more discoveries. And over the course of, I'm not sure how much time, several years. And it was pretty painful. So back to the quote. The quote was from A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, first published in 1859. And that the idea of those words came to me when I was talking to my sponsee a couple of weeks ago. And he was talking about this idea of opposites being true at the same time. And I started thinking about that. It was really only the very first couple words of that quote that I knew from the book. I never read the book. I just remembered that from wherever I remember these things. And, that it could be the best of times and the worst of times at the same time. And I really felt like that was true of recovery. Recovery feels like this a lot, where 2 opposites can be true at the same time. For example, discovering that my wife was having an affair was the most painful, most difficult, the worst, I would say, moment in my life. And yet the changes in my life that have come from recovery are really the best thing that's happened to me. So while I didn't see them both at the same time, I think they were both true at the same time. And I think there's a lot of things like that in our lives that can be true. Many opposites can be true at the same time. And I think it kind of boils down to perspective. The AA Big Book says, when I focus on what's good today, I have a good day. And when I focus on what's bad, I have a bad day. And I found that really to be true. Same section, same chapter in the Big Book says, my serenity is inversely proportional to my expectations and directly proportional to my level of acceptance. And also, I heard in recovery from a good friend of mine, when I change the way I look at things, the things I look at change. That's been attributed to Albert Einstein. And then in the 9-step promises, I will not regret the past, nor will she shut the door on it. And that's really all about focus, about perspective on the past. In my marriage today, I can be in the midst of serious conflict, and I know that I'm loved. So on to the topic that I don't want to talk about, but feel compelled to, because I think I need to. There's a sort of a joke in COSA that for a program about sex, we never talk about sex. And there are actually now 2 meetings that I know of that are focused on talking about sex. And so I'm going to talk about sex, not because I want to, but because I feel like I need to. And it's good for me too. I don't actually go to those meetings because it's too painful for me. I have gone a couple of times. I don't know, maybe 3, 4, 5 times. One of them is right in the middle of the workday for me, and it's really hard to get back to work after that. But what I found is that when I have talked about this, it's really hard, and hard isn't necessarily bad. I tend to shy away from things that are hard. My wife is kind of the same way, but I think that this is hard is, the easy route in our lives is not really the most growth oriented route. So I think somewhere along the lines of my life, I came to this belief that the frequency of sex was sort of a barometer of marriage in some way. And I think underlying that, I was thinking about this today, I think underlying that belief was a belief that sex and intimacy were sort of the same or some related. And then also that by extension, that intimacy was an indicator or equivalent to having a quality marriage or relationship. And so I think some of that is true, but relationships are complicated. And so just that, that idea, it just isn't something that I, by extension, the frequency of sex is necessarily a barometer of a relationship. I suppose it can be, but I don't know that it always is. I know that it isn't always. I'll say it that way. I've read some journal entries from way back when I was dating my wife, and there was a craving for intimacy then that I can see. I also saw some hints about the addiction that I would never have been able to connect to that, but they're there. And I found that really interesting too. I would say that today, I'm going to jump to today and then kind of go back to some history. I am in a sexless marriage. It's not 0, but it's very close to 0. I'll say clinically sexless marriage. I've looked up some numbers. Of course, Wikipedia is the truth, right? And I won't quote the numbers to you, but that's been a painful thing for me. And yet at the same time, another pair of seemingly opposite things, I still enjoy intimacy in my marriage. And the lack of sex is not something that that's causing me to walk away from my marriage at this time. Maybe it will at some point. I don't know. Sort of a history on how we got here. Back before marriage, we had a commitment to abstinence. I thought it was a mutual commitment. It was explicitly a mutual commitment, but there was a point in time when something happened and it became clear to me that maybe she was willing to break that commitment. I don't know if that's just passion in the moment or whatever, but looking back, that kind of stood out to me. Looking back post discovery, that sort of stood out to me as maybe an early indication around the addiction. Maybe it's not. I don't know. I don't know how to judge these things. I remember also having this discussion. We went to a pre-marriage class, and it was like a group thing, and they were talking about averages of sex. How often couples typically have sex. What I recall, the number was like 2 or 3 times a week or something is sort of the average. And we kind of snickered to ourselves and thought, oh, we're going to be way above that average. And I think we were probably on our honeymoon, maybe a few weeks after that. I don't know. I don't remember all those details. It was a long time ago. But I do know that over time, And I don't even know when this was. There was a decline to the point where we basically weren't having sex anymore. And it was frustrating to me because I was interested, and I was pretty much always the one that was trying to initiate. And I have this, what I call this initiation rejection cycle. I would initiate typically wordlessly and get rejected. And then some other time, next night or a week later, whatever, right? Over and over and over and over and over, there would be this rejection. And it got to the point where that's the key thing for me right now, is that it's so hard because I've been rejected so many times, that it's just really difficult for me to initiate sex. And I'll get to her side of that in a moment. And some of it is the lack of skills, verbal skills to talk about it. We have talked about this multiple times, but it hasn't really been, I hate to use the word productive, because I think all of these discussions go somewhere, but it doesn't feel, I don't see any progress. That's probably a better way to see it. I don't see progress, even though there probably is progress in the talking about this stuff. And we're probably overdue for another talk. It's been a while since we really talked about it. It's sort of like I kind of hinted at, we're sort of avoiders of difficult things, and that's a difficult thing to talk about. So at some point, I managed to muster up the courage to talk about this. And it turned out that I'm going to use some absolute language. She always felt like I wanted to have sex. So anytime I would touch her, it was particularly touch, because that was the way I initiated. It could be in the middle of the day, in the kitchen. I would touch her arm or something. And she interpreted that to mean that I was initiating sex. I was trying to initiate sex. And this came out in the conversation that we had. And I felt like she never wanted to have sex. So these two absolutes, right, that were very far apart from each other. And so we came up with a plan. I'll call it the plan, perhaps even an agreement, that we would have sex one day a week on a specific day. And like, for me, this was like, way more frequently than we were having sex. So this was a great plan for me, and I could accept it once a week. And for her, it was a win, because she was like, every time he's touching me, if it's not that day, I don't go to this place of like, he's trying to initiate sex. And so we actually got to the point where we were boasting to our friends about this plan this agreement that we had, and how great it was. And it was great for a while. I don't know how long, probably not very long. Again, this was a while ago. And what happened was, this is my interpretation, the plan was kind of incomplete. There was no discussion of what happens if she says no or rejects me on the day. Like, does that mean that rolls over to the next day? Or I don't know. We never discussed that. And of course, it's so difficult for us to talk about this stuff that we didn't. And so there would be the days that didn't happen. And so then I would start to initiate maybe on the next day. And then that didn't really meet her, ideas of what the agreement was. And neither of us wanted to talk about it. And so we never did. And it just kind of fell back to where we were before, which was basically no sex. And there was another thing that happened during this period that I'm a little ashamed of. I was secretly tracking the frequency of our sexual encounters, and not only the frequency, but also I had a rating system. I don't know. I was thinking about this today, and I sort of equate. I'm losing the word. I relate this back to the hypervigilance. I just saw this today, that it was some form of control and of attempting to have some evidence for something at some point in time where I could aha again. And of course, that never happened either. And I didn't keep the data. It felt ridiculous at some point, but somehow it felt okay, or it felt better to have something backing me up or supporting me, or that I was controlling, than having nothing. And it just felt like there was something there that was good. So enter 2012, which I'll call the crossover year. This year, I started training for a pretty significant athletic event, and my sex drive decreased in the midst of that training. And this was also the year that her addiction started, I don't know what words to use, increasing. She found new ways to feed the addiction. I mean, this is all sort of speculation. That's the year that she had the first affair. It started probably in June, is what I understand. So I was sort of having this declining sex drive, and she sort of had this perhaps increasing sex drive. And I sort of feel like that was the crossover year. Not that that's, anything interesting, but I guess it was just sort of an interesting data point to me. Yeah, I suppose we can't cause it or cure it, or whatever the other C is. I can't remember. So discovery was in October of that year. So after discovery, I think that I was probably attempting to fix the problem of the addiction with sex. I think this is not an uncommon thing for COSAs to do. We were trying things. There was sexting and photos, and our sex was more spontaneous. It was more frequent. From my perspective, I think that I was probably trying to save the marriage in some way. And I don't, trying to be something else or do something differently, because I didn't know what else to do. I can't speak for what that was for her. So I won't even go there. I think maybe it made me feel more secure in the marriage. I don't know. But another interesting thing happened around that time. I was seeing a therapist, and the therapist asked me point blank, what if there was no more sex in your marriage? What would you stay? And that was a really difficult question. I think I was afraid of the answer. I think I was afraid of that answering would be some form of commitment, even though it was just, some commitment to my therapist. But I felt like I would have to follow through on whatever I said. And I just couldn't. I was totally blocked by that question. And it sort of haunted me for a while. And as I was thinking about it today, do I even need to answer that question? And I sort of related it back to one of my discoveries, where I think it was the last one, the most recent one, where I felt like I started to try to prepare for the next time. But I stopped myself and I realized I can't prepare for something that may or may not happen in the future. And I don't know who I'm going to be at that point in time. Like, I'm going to be a different person. So how can I prepare? Because my life was so filled with preparing for all the what ifs. Like that's the way I ran my life. Like, I would run through all the possible scenarios about something. Could be work, could be, every area of my life. This is what I did in my head. I'd spin on all the possible things, and I try to solve all the problems, all the permutations. And I've spent so many brain cycles doing that. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's productive for me. I heard one time in a meeting, somebody said, my life is filled with horrible tragedies, most of which have never happened. And that really describes my life. I tried to look up that quote, and it's sort of an amalgamation of a bunch of people over thousands of years. And so that's not a direct quote of anybody other than the guy who said it in the meeting. But yeah, so I've come to the conclusion that I don't want to answer what if questions anymore in most cases. That just doesn't do anything for me. It just doesn't do anything positive for me. It does lots of negative things for me. So from maybe around 2015 to the present, We have had several talks about sex. She has stated, probably with some absolute language, that she would be okay without sex for the rest of her life. That didn't thrill me. But I realized that I am willing to accept that for now. And it's not zero, but it's just close to zero. I don't know how to say that any other way. I guess I can't say that another way. I don't know if it's useful to quantify, but for some number of years, it was about twice a year. And it's actually lower than that now. I can't actually remember when the last time was. It was probably over a year ago. I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful for anybody or not. But there's this piece that I talked about before about this initiation. Oh, and she has expressed willingness. So there's that. Willingness really without desire. That's kind of how I would characterize what she said in the past. And so as a result of this initiation rejection cycle in me, we're sort of I feel like I'm sort of at a standstill, but I know that we can talk about it. And I've had a lot of, there's been a lot of intimacy in other ways, mostly non-physical intimacy. And yeah, it's a lot of mutual sharing of joys and of struggles. There'll be times at work. I struggle at work a lot. And that's another area where I would like to focus some of my recovery. And I haven't really done that because it's hard. But I know that the time is coming. I will do that at some point. But I started a new job a couple of years ago, and the interesting thing about that job change was that I had 8 specific things that I felt was God confirming me leaving my current job and taking this specific job. And so having 8 things was really kind of remarkable when I put them down on paper. One of them was that, so my birthday's coming up. It's in about a week and a half. And one of the odd things about the timing of the job, starting of the job, and one of the things that ways I'm compensated in the job is with stock. And I get a really large stock grant on my birthday. And I just thought, wow, God, that is what a great just a little thing to have been given this gift in that form. So where I was trying to go with that is about around my job. I was after the first year, I had a review, a performance review, and it was before I actually had the formal review. My boss sent me some of the paperwork, and I got to read that. And I was working from home, and I went out. My wife was home, and I went out and I told her that I don't suck, which was an interesting thing to say. And the fact that we celebrated that I don't suck together was an intimate moment. There have been many times since then where I've gone out from, I work right here. I've gone out from here and she's home, and I talk about some struggles at work, and she challenges me and she affirms me. And those are things that I don't want to call them a substitute, but these are intimacy. These are real deep forms of intimacy for me. And I really appreciate that. And I have come to recognize that this is just where I am, where we are today. And I would like to work on it and talk about it more, but it's been really hard. Oh, well, the other piece of it that I really failed to mention, this is one of the things that I picked up in one of the last Let's Talk About Sex meetings that I went to. I was really blaming everything on her. I was putting the burden of all of this on her, even though I recognized this rejection cycle and this stuff that I'm unwilling to initiate or unable or whatever. But what I realized is that there's a bunch of that's on me too. That's the real piece that's on me, and my inability or unwillingness to talk about it. I'm not bringing it up. So how do I expect to make progress? Is it just going to happen spontaneously? Is that how these things work? No, the hard stuff gains never come from just sitting on your hands. That's my experience. So I am challenged by this to make some changes in my life if I want to have anything change, I need to make the change. I need to make some progress. I need to do things differently in order to see things happen differently. So I am about out of time. My name is Brian. I'm a COSA, and I'm very appreciative of being asked to speak here. Thank you for letting me speak.
Many thanks to Brian for sharing so deeply here. I loved hearing that COSA has Let's Talk About Sex meetings. I went to a workshop at a retreat a few years ago that talked about sex positivity, and I'm hoping that SAA can open up more meetings like that. Anyway, one of the guest speakers at that workshop was Bennett, and she was the SAA speaker at this quarterly speaker meeting. And I'll be sharing more on that later. Anyway, like I said in the intro, I identify with intimacy avoidance. And when Brian mentioned that his wife recoiled from touch, man, that brings back memories for me. When my wife wanted to be sexual, there were times that she would touch me in a non-sexual way, and I would just freeze up due to my intimacy fears. You know, things have definitely improved for us over the years. One of the things that I did is I had a tool of using music to help me relax and be more present when my wife was wanting to be intimate. I would listen to this playlist, help me bring the guard down, let go of control, and open up to being vulnerable. Most of the music on that playlist was of a calming, meditative sort. And just thinking of that, I did want to share a few pieces of music that have been helping me out this week. The first piece, although it's not in that playlist of music that I just talked about, it has kind of the same effect. It's from my favorite band, Tool. They just released a new song called Opiate Squared, which is a reimagining of one of their older songs. And I did talk about this on episode 9 of the podcast. They have been playing this version of the song live for a number of years without giving it a new title. But the middle section of the song is an instrumental bit of music that is just so calming and meditative. They released this about a week ago. And of course, being the guitarist that I am, I spent my time working on creating a new guitar video for this. So this has been present in my life over the past week. And I wanted to play the middle section here, the meditative part. And so getting back to episode 9, I talked about when they played this live, and I can just remember being amongst 10,000 other people, all experiencing the spiritual moment where this music was playing and everyone just connecting with each other, and smiles everywhere and just loving it. And so I'm so glad that they finally released a studio version of this. So anyway, this is the middle section of Opiate Squared. So the beginning and end of the song are very, very aggressive and have lyrics that some in this program may or may not enjoy. So I won't be talking about that right here, but I did want to play the mellow part of the song. And this is one of the things that just helps me calm down, relax, and recenter myself. Over the past few months, I've been talking a lot about the music of hylon, and I will definitely be talking more about their music specifically in the next episode with Bennett. Bennett is a like-minded individual in terms of music with me, and we connected many years ago at a retreat over metal and other types of music. And she and I have tickets to go see hylon in September of this year in San Francisco, so I'm super excited about that. But anyway, with hylon and finding their music and other music that has been similar, I've been seeing different recordings that the band members have either collaborated with or helped produce with other bands. And this is one that I just found on YouTube, and I went down this spiral of her music. This is Kati Ran. I believe that's how you pronounce her name. And the song is Surun, I think. Again, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but it features Kai from hylon doing the low guttural throat singing. It also features Maria, who is doing some of the background vocals, and Christopher from hylon did the producing on this. And so I wanted to play a little bit of that here. So, like I mentioned right before playing this clip, that finding that I found some more of her music and found a 15-minute piece that is just amazing. And I'll be talking about that on a future episode. But I'm enjoying finding new artists like this that are connecting with me spiritually and emotionally. One of the other bands that Christopher and Maria have is a band called Euzen, which is Euzen. Predates hylon, and it's much more rock oriented. And last week when I was posting the episode with Tim, writing the show notes, I wrote down that he shared about judging others and feeling like he was being judged by other people. As soon as I started typing that, it's like, oh man, I could have added this song here to the episode. And it's a song from Euzen called Judged By. And I did want to read some of the lyrics before playing that clip. Stumble through the mist of mischief, shake your fist to all that needs to be. Self-righteousness will learn to fly. Who are you to be misjudged by? Seek it out and see your part in it. Swallow rocks to build a place to sit. Make your own shore. My mistakes are dry. Your insides is what we judge you by. I've been connecting to this song for quite a while, and I really loved it and wanted to play a clip of that here. It's so vastly different from what they've done in either hylon or the other band that I've played on a previous episode called Song Like Here. So this is Using Judged By.
Through the mist of mystery, shake your fist to all that needs to be. Self-righteousness will let it fly. Who are you to be misjudged by? Seek it out and see your part in it. Swallow rocks to build a place to sit. Make your own shore. My mistakes are dry. Your insides is what we judge you by. Leave someone with anything, let them leave with everything lost. To be lost, it's plain to see. I am soon to be judged by.
Yeah, I totally love that song, and I've since been listening to more and more of their music as well. So, like I mentioned, in the next episode, Bennett and I will be talking about music. I'm not sure if we're going to share her recording from the quarterly SAA and COSA Speaker meeting. She mentioned that some of it she still wanted to keep out of the public. So we'll probably be hitting some of the pinpoints of what she talked about, but definitely talking about how music relates to our recovery. She was one of the panelists at my workshop on music and recovery at the Bay Area retreat. Can't remember how many years ago. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to sharing that episode. So that will about wrap it up for this week. I did also want to mention that I got a recommendation and did not have a chance to pull a clip for it yet. But this comes from Kevin, and with the clips that I played from Bobby McFerrin last week, yeah, he said that he definitely has identified with a lot of his music, and one of Bobby McFerrin's albums, Medicine Man, is a deeply spiritual one. So I'll be definitely checking that out. And he also recommended Orchestra Baobab, which is Afro-Cuban music. And this was from the roughly the 1980s, around 82 to 89-ish. I've listened to some of their stuff and I have not pulled any clips for this week. But if you're interested in that, please check them out. I really love when listeners are connecting with music as I do. One of the ways that my higher power speaks to me. So if you have any musical suggestions or things that you would like to share with the podcast community, you can drop us an email at feedback@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. If you are interested in being a guest or have some general questions about the podcast, you can reach me at jason@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. So again, many thanks to the quarterly speaker meeting committee that puts these events on for us here in the Bay Area. Thanks to everyone in the Bay Area COSA community and the SAA community as well. And especially thanks to Brian for sharing his story this week. With that, I'm super grateful for you tuning in this week. And as always, keep coming back. The views and opinions contained in the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bay Area Intergroup or the ISO of SAA.